We're solving quadratic equations, and remember, a quadratic equation is anything that looks like x squared plus literally anything else. If it's just got an x squared in it, it's a quadratic equation. If it has like an x cubed, not a quadratic equation. If the highest degree term is x squared, you now have a quadratic equation. So when we have these quadratic equations, we're trying to solve them. So say you've got something like x squared plus 2x plus 5 equals 0. So we're trying to figure out where it's true. Sometimes you'll have something like x squared plus 2x equals negative 5. And again, we're trying to just figure out where is this true? For what x values is this true? Now there's 4 different methods that we are going to talk about for solving quadratic equations. First you have factoring, you have square roots, we have the quadratic formula, and we have graphing. So let's start with factoring. So for factoring, that's this one here because it's part of the foldable. The first thing you need to do is you have to put the equation in standard form. And if you remember, standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So it has to be in this form to be able to factor it. We have to have it equal to 0. So if it's not equal to 0, we just need to get everything over on one side. So I can subtract 48 from each side. And there we go. Now I'm going to factor the equation because, you know, that's the method we're using is factoring. So x squared minus 48, what multiplies to negative 48 but adds to positive 2, that would be 8x minus 6x. So I have to have x times x, that has to be negative 6, that has to be positive 8. Okay, so if you need help factoring, I have a video on that as well. But to factor this equation, I got x plus 8 equals x minus 6, and that still equals 0 because all I did is change the form. I just changed it to look from looking like this to looking like this. It's the same equation, I just changed its close. Okay, so now it looks like this. And so then what do? We say, okay, we know that one of these two factors has to equal 0, because that's something called the zero product property. But basically what it tells us is that either this has to equal 0 or this has to equal 0 for the entire thing to equal 0, right? Because it doesn't matter what was inside of here. If this equals 0, then the whole thing would equal 0. So we set each of our factors equal to 0. We say x plus 8 has to equal 0, or x minus 6 has to equal 0. We solve those and we get x equals negative 8 would make that true, or x equals positive 6 would also make that true. So what we just found is that negative 8 and positive 6 make this function true. If I put negative 8, I'd get out 0. If I put in positive 6, I'd get out 0. And since this function is the same function as this one, negative 8 and positive 6 also make this function true. So these two are both my solutions. Okay, the solution to this quadratic equation is both of those. Okay. The next one we're going to talk about is taking the square root. So to take the square root, you have to only have an x squared. You can't have any x terms to take the square root. If you have x terms, you have to use factoring, graphing, or quadratic equation. You cannot use the square root because you can't take the square root of it because you can't get x squared by itself. If you just have an x squared term, you can do the square root. The first thing you need to do is get the square root all on one side. So we have x squared, 2x squared equals 70 minus 14, which is 56. Then we divide by 2, and we get x squared equals 30, 28. And then we take the square root of both sides. So x squared is all by itself, so we need to go ahead and take the square root of both sides. And so x equals plus or minus root 28. And then we can simplify that. Let's see, 28 has 1 or 2 and 14, and then 2 and 7. So we can take a 2 out, and a 7 stays in, so we have x equals plus or minus 2 root 7. Do not forget the plus or minus. But when you take the square root of both sides of an equation, you have to add the plus or minus So these are two different answers. This is positive 2 root 7 and negative 2 root 7. Okay. The next one would be graphing the quadratic equation. So we go ahead and graph it on a calculator because remember the solution to a quadratic equation, the solution to any equation, is the x-intercepts. The solution is where it crosses the x-axis. So we can just calculate those 2 points wherever it crosses the x-axis, and those are our solutions. Those are the things that make this true. So let me pull my calculator up for you. So here's my function. I had to zoom out just a little bit to be able to see both zeros. We're going to go ahead and calculate the zeros. So I go ahead and calc 0, and that just tells me, it's just going to tell me where it crosses the x-axis. So I need a left bound, so I need to go to the left of that 0. Then I need a right bound, I need to go to the right of the 0. I push enter, enter, and that 0 is at -4, and then I could calculate the other one the same way. So if you are allowed to use a calculator, you can always calculate the zeros using a calculator. Our final option is the quadratic formula. Now these other options only work in certain instances, right? Taking the square root only works when you have just an x squared. Factoring only works when it's a factorable equation, when it happens to have nice, pretty factors, has nice, pretty zeros. So that one doesn't always work. Graphing works every time if you have a calculator, but the quadratic formula works every single time, all the time, no matter what. You never get out answers that aren't, like you can never get stuck with the quadratic formula. The only kicker is that it's actually kind of a complicated formula to remember. But once you remember the quadratic formula, you'll find it's actually really easy because you can just plug stuff in. In fact, our foreign exchange students last year told me that they learned this before they learned anything else. They learned the quadratic formula first, and then they used it to factor because it works every single time. So it's great. So the quadratic formula says x is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So if a function is in standard form, remember ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, then we can just plug a, b, and c into this function and it will work. It will tell us the answers. So we got to get our function into that form. So we have 3x squared plus 4x, and we need to subtract 10 from both sides so that we have it in standard form. So that means a equals 3, b equals 4, and c equals negative 10. So then I can just plug it in. The solution is x is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, I just plugged each of those numbers in. So I have x equals negative 4 plus or minus the square root of, let's see, that's 30. Negative 30 times 4, that's 120. So that's 136 all over 6. Square root of 136 doesn't come out pretty. So let's see what we can simplify it to. Since it's even, I always just pick 2. So we go 136 divided by 2 is 68. That divided by 2 is 34. That divided by 2 is 17. So 136 is the same as 2 times 2 times 2 times 17. So I take the square root of that, and I can take a 2 outside. So I'm going to have 2 root, and then the 2 times 17 stays inside, so 34 stays inside. So I have x is equal to negative 4 plus or minus 2 root 34 over 6. And it's pretty much done. The only thing that I see that I can simplify more is that each of these is divisible by 2. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to say x is equal to negative 2 plus or minus root 34 over 3. So I just divided every single term by 2. And that's it. Those are our two solutions. It doesn't look like two solutions, but really if you plugged those numbers into the calculator, you would find that these are just decimals. So it's negative 2 plus root 34 over 3 and negative 2 minus root 34 over 3. So again, the quadratic formula works every single time. If it comes out to a nice pretty number, then you know that it was factorable. If it comes out to a number like this, this function was not factorable in the first place. So if we tried to factor it, we would have just hit a roadblock and we couldn't have done it. So those are your 4 ways of solving a quadratic equation.